variety of topics. That's the added challenge.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the IPPR's panel on trade. My name is Lucy White. As some of you eagle-eyed Bloomberg watchers, if there are any of you in the audience, might know, I am not Lizzie Burden, as it might say on your on your program. I am her slightly less glamorous, but hopefully as well-informed colleague, Lucy White.
It's not true.
I can confirm this. She's very well
She is very
informed on
glamorous.
trade. Oh, no. I meant you know your stuff on trade. That's right.
I'm joined by Ali Renison of SEC Newgate. I'm joined by Marley Morris of the IPPR. I am joined by Steve Parker of the British International Freight Association. Didn't want to get that wrong.
Yes.
And I am joined by Liam Byrne, the chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee in Parliament. And what a year it has been for international trade. We've had the EU and the UK agree broad terms, heads of terms for their future negotiations, if you can remember that far back. We've had the UK signing its long-awaited deal with India. And of course, we've had Trump 2.0 in the White House and everything that has meant for the global multilateral trading order and seemingly announcements coming out by the day. So perhaps I can let each of the speakers introduce themselves and give a 5-minute introduction on what they think are perhaps some of the most important things that have come up over the past year. Liam, do you want to start?
I'm very happy to start. Thank you. Very good to see everybody. So let me just kick off with 3 thoughts to get the conversation going. So first, a huge thank you to IPPR for the work that they're doing in this space. So for those of you who haven't read Marley's work, please do have a look at it. It's very thoughtful, it's very detailed, it's kind of on point. And the work that IPPR do in this field is something that a lot of ministers have come to rely on over the last year. And it's certainly something that we draw on a lot on the Business and Trade Select Committee. So Marley, a huge thank you to the work that you do at the IPPR. I should also say, by way of introduction, that I've taken the precaution before coming today of launching an inquiry. And that inquiry is into what the Business and Trade Committee does in 2026. So the way that we think about our work plan is not sitting around in a committee room thinking about all the great ideas that we're interested in. We actually take the committee on the road, we travel up and down the land, we hold a big business conference in Westminster. And from those hundreds of conversations, we basically distill the key themes that we think you want us to focus on. And so we're about to embark on that exercise again in a couple of weeks' time, but the inquiry is now open if you want to submit evidence. So if you've got particular topics or issues on questions on trade that you want us as a select committee to be zeroing in on, then we'd love your thoughts on that. So the big picture, as you rightly say, is it's been a heck of a year, lots of deals done. And I think what I've admired most is that as America recalibrates its role in the global economy, as it begins to exit from the multilateral system that it created after World War II, you've had Britain not just step up, but help lead, help marshal this coalition of the willing to defend the rules-based free trading system. And with not only signing free trade deals of our own, we're defending free trade deals. So I think what is especially important is not just getting the free trade deals done, it's actually winding around them these defense alliances, which are going to become force multipliers for some of the bigger trade deals and export growth of the future. So if you think about the work that we're doing with the Australians in AUKUS, or with the Japanese through GCAP Tempest, or the defense alliances that we have in the Gulf, or the work that we're doing with northern NATO in particular, you know, we're not just defending free trade philosophically, we're defending it militarily as well. And historically, at the point we're in, that's a really important development. Now, in the new Labour days in which I served, we came to learn that one of the great perils in politics is that you arrive at this moment, which we call the post-euphoria, pre-delivery moment. And it's a kind of deep trough, and it's quite dark, and the first blush of winning an election and getting deals signed is very much now left to you, and you're actually trying to get shit done. You're trying to deliver it. You're trying to drive things through. And that is where this government is now at in lots of different ways. And it's definitely there in trade. So many of the free trade deals that we've signed are not yet implemented. There are still provisions in lots of them that need driving through. And by far and away, the most important of those is our trade deal with the European Union. The reality is that, in my humble opinion, ministers still need to be spending a heck of a lot more time in Brussels than they are today. And they need to be grinding through a lot more of the detail a lot faster. Now, it's a kind of a two-way conversation in Brussels. So, it's not entirely down to the UK to inject the kinetic energy that's needed into moving those bargains forward. But we have really got to move faster on deepening the relationship with Europe than we are moving today. Right now, we are moving too slowly in deepening that relationship, and we need to be pushing much, much harder. The final point I'd just offer on the table then to round up is to just add one new dimension to this conversation, which is around economic security. So the way in which we think about trade can't simply be about trade deals. It can't simply be about defending our allies. It's also got to be about transforming our mutual economic security. So if you think about what's going to happen over the next kind of 5 to 10 years, you've got the threat surface for most businesses is now much, much greater because of the scope of their digital operations. Open brackets, just look at what happened to Jaguar Land Rover in the last fortnight, close brackets. Threat surface now much bigger. But second, you've now got state actors, state-backed actors in that mix, so far more deadly, far more lethal. But then third, we're about to try and encourage about £1 trillion worth of investment into the UK economy. A significant amount of that money is going to come from other countries. Some of that money is going to come from China. And so unless we begin to rethink our economic security arrangements for new times, then we are not going to be the safest place in the world to do business, which is what we should be seeking to become. So thinking about how we defend critical supply chains, how we secure access to chips, how do we control technology diffusion, how do we secure access to critical minerals in the future, how do we build a kind of economic NATO that brings together our allies in AUKUS, in Japan, in the Gulf, elsewhere, in Europe, to help ensure that we are de-risking the threats that we know are there to the UK economy, is now going to be something that is going to become more and more important. And it's going to require us remaking the relationship between the state and the market, because what is about to happen is an explosion in the private ownership of what is ultimately public risk. And JLR kind of really lights this up. Private company, didn't have cyber insurance, vulnerable to attack. When it goes wrong, actually the state looks at 100,000 jobs in the supply chain and says, well, do you know what? We just can't let that go down. We're going to have to put some state-backed guarantees in to help the recovery program. We are in the foothills of those kind of threats for the future. And so unless we rethink the way that government and the private sector work together to safeguard those economic risks, then we're going to be more and more vulnerable to these kind of perils in the years to come. And because we are an open trading nation and a small island, we're going to have to think about doing that kind of work, not just domestically, but internationally.
Ali, as a former government trade advisor yourself, I'm not sure whether you will have been relieved to have not been involved in government in the last year or not, but yeah, what are your thoughts on some of those themes that Liam's laid out and how the current government might be able to put those into action?
I mean, I think it would have been great to have actually been involved in a government that was working on a trade strategy and trying to bring some sort of coherence to policy priorities that weren't just fetishizing kind of FTAs, but seeing it in the bigger picture. I mean, I think the reality is, and we're getting a little bit of that sort of reverberating here in the UK and across Europe and beyond, not just the US, is that the warnings that I sort of have to give to industry is that the days of trade being a fairly laissez-faire, relatively free to a certain extent from government intervention are completely over, completely gone. And there are opportunities and there are challenges to that. And I'll take sort of some of those in turn. So on the opportunity front, I think that, for example, the recalibration of how the government can be involved as a force for good for what matters for international trade are changing. We are no longer just looking at the FTA tin. We are looking looking at things like, what does collaboration for other sectors and other departments look like to help sort of boost trade? Whether that's the space sector, whether that is the services sector, what actually really matters, and how we think about what do businesses trade, and what can we do to actually help them, whether that's sort of MOUs, collaboration, or even I think the trade strategy does a fantastic thing of, I think, formalizing the departure away from just focusing on free trade deals and saying we're going to do more bite-sized versions of kind of agreements that matter for trade. We're going to go in some areas sector by sector, and other areas kind of cross-cutting, whether it's sort of regulated sort of regulations around professional qualifications. We're going to do a little bit more granular approach to what matters. Now, I think there's also a little bit of a challenge to that of how does industry really get involved, because when I certainly was in the department, there were very clear stakeholder engagement mechanisms for consulting industry on trade deals. That becomes a little bit more opaque and difficult to do in terms of tracking what industry wants when you're doing a lot more sort of bite-sized, smaller versions of trade policy agreements. But it's interesting to see that, and I understand why in my lifetime in the department, the concept of MOUs was kind of laughed at, because if we weren't doing trade deals, the government at the time was saying we're doing these MOUs with the individual U.S. states, and people would laugh and say that's not, I think in a slightly Brexitized way, that's not a trade deal, and it doesn't matter, and it's not binding. But actually, one of the great things that I like about MOUs is that it brings, it's a little bit more flexible, and it looks at sort of what matters for collaboration to help drive trade in a much more kind of all-encompassing kind of way. And actually, frankly, I quite like the US state-level MOU program, because it brought industry into the discussion to say, when it comes to the US, what outside of the federal competence level can you actually do state by state to sort of identify, never mind sort of tackle some of these barriers. Turning more, I think, to the challenge side of it, and it's interesting to see some of what's reverberating out of Washington coming across to the UK in the economic security lexicon. I think we are no longer just looking at trade for facilitative purposes. We're looking at it from a sort of securitization point of view. And I think that there are definite rationales and reasons for that, because certain trade facilitation measures have been probably leveraged by some companies from the Far East, who I won't mention. But that has become their business sort of model, so to speak. And that sort of when you look at things like the way in which de minimis is changing. So for those who aren't aware, for all the focus on tariffs, de minimis is basically under a certain threshold, you don't have to deal with tariffs. That's the easiest way of explaining it for certain parcel sort of shipments, because the cost of administering tariffs is basically was seen as sort of outweighing the sort of benefit to the exchequer, so to speak. In the US, it was much bigger. The threshold was $800, and there was a genuine consideration about kind of what was being sort of used under that threshold. The UK is now looking at doing stuff like that, and I know that it is causing a huge sort of concern amongst logistics kind of industry, which takes me on to the wider question about how do we make sure, in a sort of an era where we are no longer just talking about trade for facilitation purposes, but for economic security purposes, that we are not completely throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of what do we need to help genuine, and I use this in a generic sense, not the technical sense, trusted traders actually carry on making us more efficient. And this is the last thing I'll say, because I'm sure that Steve from BIFA will probably sort of expound on this. There is a tendency, I think, to think about what the only thing that matters for trade is the kind of policy agreements we're doing with other countries, without looking inwards about, if you compare the UK to the Dutch really do trade, and they take trade very, very seriously. The physical movement of trade and being as efficient as possible in terms of keeping the cost low in good times and bad is something that they take very seriously. I'm tempted to mention Singapore, but I know that became a political football and sort of under previous prime ministers around Singapore on Thames. But I think that when we talk about linking trade policy to what drives international trade, we have to look at all of the parts of the equation, what we can do domestically, whether it's around our goods border, what we can do in terms of policy agreements that aren't just trade deals, and what is the link between the agreements that we strike, whether they are FTAs, MOUs, sort of customs, cooperation agreements, for example, with other countries. How do we then get that from policy as a sort of abstract to getting businesses to actually make use of it? So I think it's really interesting, just my final thought, that Chris Bryant, as the new trade minister under Peter Kyle, has combined the ministerial brief of exports and trade policy. That's a huge, huge piece to take on. Before, they were kept separate in the department. But I think it speaks to the idea that we don't just want to do trade as an abstract concept. We really actually want to drive it into sort of exports and wider international trade, both inbound and outbound.
Yeah, Steve, I mean, your business is perhaps as much concerned with doing the trade as it is the trade policy itself. So, I mean, how can we get better at that?
Okay, so just very briefly, Steve Parker, work for BIFA, which is the trade association. All of our members are moving this freight across the border. They're all moving freight internationally, whatever type of freight it is, we're doing it. And all of these topics are really important to us, whether we talk about the EU reset, whether we talk about trade agreements, or whether we talk about de minimis. All of those impact our members because it's our members who are actually doing the paperwork, sending the data, all of that sort of stuff that makes that work and means that freight can flow in and out of our country rightly and properly and compliantly, but also as easy as possible. And we work really hard. So we talk about trade agreements. We work really hard with our customers, the traders, the importers and the exporters in and out of the UK, to make sure they're aware of what they need to do to get the full benefit of these trade agreements. We worked also with the Department of Business and Trade to talk about which companies aren't getting the full benefit, and we share data and information. So it's our members that are right on the border that are there making all of this move. And we always want to make it better. I do get a bit fed up with being told how good the Dutch are or Singapore are. Actually, we're British. We could do better than this. And I think there is a good way of making the border as smooth as it can be and fulfilling all the criteria that you need it to fulfill. We are very good at getting data and getting information in advance. We know what freight we move. Very often we know it's coming well in advance. We have to do export declarations out of the country of origin, so we know what we are moving. And we want to be able to use that data in a really smart and efficient way so that actually trade can come in and out of this country as well as possible. And we are ready, and we work in partnership with the various government agencies that work at the border. We are there to help. We are there to share our information and our best practices and work together. Very much partnership. You know, this is not us sitting here moaning about what goes on at the border. We want to be involved in what goes on at the border because we want to make it in a way that's great for everyone. And I think we're in a great opportunity. That there is an opportunity for change here. I think the timing is right to do something new. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of change. Keeping up with what Donald Trump does, for a start, is a headache. And that requires smart and intelligent thinking so that as these parts of the world change, we can adapt quickly and we can remain flexible and we can deliver what we need to. At the end of the day, companies who manufacture in this country need their spare parts. They're not going to get them if they don't come across the border efficiently and effectively. And we are really keen to do that, and we really work hard to make that as smart as it can be. And you know, we're here to work with government and the various government departments to make sure that we can do that. So yeah, that's about where I am with all of that. We're ready, and we want to do something different. We want to do something that's bright and smart and intelligent.
Marley, you've obviously done a lot of work on this topic yourself. We have the industry saying that they want to do something that's different and bright and smart. What does the UK need?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And as I say, thank you to Stephen, to BIFA for sponsoring this event as well. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess stepping back for a second and reflecting some of the points that others have made. I mean, we are in a critical moment for trade. There are huge challenges that the UK faces. You've got rising protectionism. You know, we found in our recent report, the number of trade restrictions in 2022 was nearly 3,000, which compared to a decade earlier was under 300. So a tenfold increase in trade restrictions. And that's before, of course, Trump's second term and all the tariff measures we've seen since then, and of course the threats of economic coercion from a number of potential trade partners. You've also got of course, over the last few decades, there's the significant rise in global value chains, combined with the threat of supply chains being disrupted, the impacts, of course, of COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course all the points that Liam made about how these wider threats are continuing in terms of the supply chain vulnerabilities. And that's now been exposed, and there's some real questions about how the UK ensures security going forward. And then I think another issue, which is perhaps less on the agenda right now, but I think is growing, is the issue of supply chain sustainability, and in particular how the EU, as I guess, is the key leader in this, but other countries are following suit, how you manage questions of climate and trade in a way that brings a wide consensus multilaterally on board, where you clearly have these tensions at the moment on things like the EU deforestation regulation or the CBAM between the EU and the global south. How do you deal with these things? They're going to become even bigger over the next few years. And I think a bit like what you were saying, Ali, I mean, I think the government's done actually a remarkably good job in a very difficult scenario, both in terms of the trade deals it's secured, but also in terms of the trade strategy, very clearly setting out both the challenge, but also a fairly comprehensive set of measures and proposals to take forward. And I think importantly, as you said, it's looking beyond FDAs, both because they're not necessarily the only tool to use, but also because actually, and this links to the points you were making, that most businesses actually don't necessarily know the details of FTAs, they don't know how to use them, and so how do you get those FTAs to be implemented, and how do you actually make sure that what businesses need matches the types of the deals that you're negotiating? So I think that was a core part of the trade strategy, and I think it's absolutely welcome. I guess the areas, going back to your original point, Lucy, what are the areas where we think the government should be focusing on going forward? So supply chain agreements, I think, is something that's sort of touched on in the trade strategy, and I think there's more opportunities. Again, thinking a bit about how, going beyond your traditional FTA model, how you build collaboration and coordination on supply chains, particularly for really critical goods, obviously critical minerals, where there are real priorities for coordination, and also thinking a bit about how you jointly invest in the infrastructure for trade again. So I think that links to the points that we've been making about how you make sure basically that you think about trade not just in terms of getting a deal over the line, but actually how you invest in the border itself and making sure those processes work smoothly. The second area, I think, is export support. So that was talked about a lot in the trade strategy as well, and the kind of recognition that that's not up to scratch at the moment. Clearly needs to be much better targeted, clearer information on how you, yes, use FTAs, but also just navigating the basics of customs and how you do that. We're seeing some of the evidence from DBT surveys, actually the number of businesses who have exported falling slightly. So I think there needs to be more work to actually ensure that businesses are aware of the opportunities and they know how to navigate these processes. And how do you do that best? Is it through central government, or is it actually through local chambers of commerce, through other trade specialists, and of course also through the kind of network of through the FCDO, the network of specialists in different embassies and consulates. And then finally, I guess, again, kind of linking to the point that Liam made at the beginning, that there's a question around sort of our trade defences in relation to our economic security. I think, again, the trade strategy talks about reviewing our trade defences. There is, as I said, a real risk around economic coercion. The EU has this particular instrument to deal with economic coercion. Do we need something similar? Do we need to update some of our trade defences to factor in more explicitly some of the priorities around economic security? So these are some of the areas. And just my final point would be on the EU reset. Again, absolutely need to deliver on the things that were in the reset. So, SBS, youth mobility. So good to see that being discussed at conference this week. But also, are there opportunities to actually go further? I mean, I think there are some areas where there's clearly scope for further conversation. Defence is obviously one. Another, I think, is energy and climate. I mean, there were some good things actually in the reset, but I think fleshing that out in more detail. Again, on critical minerals, I think another important area, and on digital and tech actually as well. And I think another area where the UK and the EU, I think, could do more in collaboration going forward.
Absolutely. And I mean, Marley, picking up on that last point you made, Liam, when you were giving your remarks at the beginning, you said that you would like to see ministers spend a lot more time in the EU. Do you think we've reached a point in our conversation, in our political discourse in the UK now, I suppose, in that the electorate, the voters as a whole, would like to see more cooperation with the EU? Because obviously, post-Brexit, there was a lot of tension around that point.
100%. I mean, the work that I've published through Best of Britain and YouGov last week basically creates a new segmentation of the reform vote. So the reform vote today is not one standing army. It's a coalition of 5 different groups. 2 or 3 of them are quite intractable. They're beyond the reach of mainstream parties. But 2 are absolutely persuadable by mainstream politics. One of the questions that we tested in the polling we published last Thursday was, even if you supported Brexit, do you think it's been well implemented? And amongst those groups that are more amenable to coming back to mainstream politics, overwhelmingly they just think Brexit was completely screwed up. And so for Labour in particular, that is important. But more important even than that is the reality that British politics is basically now bifurcating into 2 blocks, a right bloc and a left bloc. The right bloc basically voted for Brexit, the left bloc basically didn't. Reform is riding high at the moment because they are eating the Tories for breakfast, dinner and tea. They have consolidated the right-wing bloc. On the left vote is pretty fragmented between Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, Independents. We're losing 2 to 3 times more votes to the Greens and the Lib Dems than we are to Reform. So, you saw that recognition underlying the brilliant speech that we've just heard from Keir Starmer. We have got to really double down now on consolidating the left bloc, and actually we have got a fair bit of scope, I think, to really drive a better relationship with our European neighbour, because amongst those groups of reform voters who are persuadable, they're actually quite open-minded to the fact that things have been completely screwed up in the past, and actually a different kind of approach is now needed for the future. So I think the politics is absolutely behind an approach that is much more assertive when it comes to Europe. And that's before you get into the work that we've got to do on shared defence and procurement, shared economic security arrangements, coordinated defences against Chinese dumping. And the more that we can coordinate with allies like Japan, Australia, South Korea, the better.
Yeah, and Steve, there are certain elements of trade that closer agreement with the EU will help to solve, but there's a lot more that needs addressing as well, right?
There's been a lot of talk about the SPS goods, the changes there, but actually there are changes that could come in a lot of areas, but there are things that need to be done. Freight moves across the border. Somehow we've got to know it's moving across the border. We've got to know it's safe. We've got to know it's secure. And that's where we can really help and work together, whether that's EU, and there's be a different set of regulations with the EU than we might have with the rest of the world. And we need to be there ready to do that. And we certainly are and ready to embrace whatever political change comes to make it work. Because political change is one thing, but it's still got to move and it's still got to come, A to B, it's still got to happen. We also, by the way, work with importers and exporters on how to do this. So, we are part of a monthly webinar that the Department of Trade and Industry run that we go and we tell traders how to work across the border. How do you move freight across the border? It's very well saying, right, I've got this product, I want to sell it all over the world. Well, actually, how do you do that? Our members are pretty good at helping to do so. And so we try and give a bit of education that says, right, this is how we can make it work. This is what you as a trader needs to do. This is what we will do as an industry to help, and then pull all of that together to make it as easy and as streamlined as we can.
But this point about SPSD is so important. And actually the thing that really brought it home to the committee was custard.
Yeah.
And so we, to really just kind of get our heads around what was happening in Northern Ireland, we spent a day just walking through the £67 million new border facilities that were having to be built there. Yep. And they very proudly took us into the freezer block to kind of show us 2 very large cartons of like ambrosia custard. And they had both had to be confiscated. Yep. Because on St. Patrick's Day, someone had forgotten to send through the forward notification, and the pots weren't labelled for resale in the EU or something. They had the wrong labelling on. And so there you are, as the rest of Ireland is sort of, beginning to party, there were the poor border folks having to unload lorries full of custard, which would then be destroyed. I mean, just utter madness.
And I mean, we see that, not all the time, but that sort of thing does happen. And you're right, it's stupidity. Common sense has been lost. And we work a lot with our members in Northern Ireland. How is it we can make this border work? It's such a unique border. Where else in the world?
I think it's because someone had changed the definition of custard. They
Well,
weren't quite sure if it was a dairy product or whether it was an amalgam.
And here we are.
And this confusion hadn't been resolved by the time it was complicated.
And here we are.
One of the,
Utter madness.
So yeah, but I think the SPS. I mean, I hope it's next government proof, because I distinctly recall. I'm not going to try and draw Liam on this. I distinctly recall the vibe in Brussels when Theresa May's withdrawal deal was voted down 3 times, and she was pretty much almost begging the Commission to sort of be a bit more flexible and make some changes to try and get it through. And the appetite in Brussels was just like, you're probably not going to be around very long, so why would we do that? I hope that the EU is similarly motivated or not motivated in the sort of, thinking about what might come in 3 years and not sort of press, foot on the gas, frankly, because the last thing industry wants to see is border inspection posts go up and down and back up again, frankly. But on the actual sort of substance of the reset, I mean, I think that one of the considerations that I would love to see the Home Office taken under sort of review, and I know that sort of this is something of relevance to certainly sort of BIFM's members, is why are we doing safety and security declarations? Why we didn't ask for an exemption during the Brexit negotiations. Fine, that was that government's prerogative. And this is basically almost sort of a duplication of having a customs declaration. Norway doesn't have it, Switzerland doesn't have it, there are levers, there are waivers. We're not asking for an exemption because the Home Office doesn't feel like playing ball. And I think that it would be nice to see, there's some big ticket items around the SPS agreement and sort of a ETS kind of alignment that the government is prioritizing. But there's also some really bread and butter stuff around customs cooperation that you think would be fairly easy to do. And certainly from discussions I've had with government, it's just not really in the purview. Now, some people might say that's because the EU's, we have a customs union, we're not in the customs union, so there's only so much you can do. The EU does loads of cooperation measures with third countries. So love the big ticket stuff, but would be nice to see, we're literally just across the channel, a little bit more ambition on what our cooperation objectives look like on the daily bread and butter stuff beyond just SPS.
So Ali, for me, there's a couple of bits there. First of all, we, as BIFA, lobby and say, look, SNS declarations, why do we need to do them? We get that. But then we have to be practical too. So if they become the regulation, then we have to make sure we can do them. And it's that working together to make sure that we can move these goods across the border and that we have got the data we need and that we are being asked for data that makes a lot of sense. In some cases we're not, but it's working together to get that going. So there's the 2 elements. There's the lobbying to say why are we doing this in the first place, but if we are going to do it, then how are we going to do it? How's that going to work? Can we work with us? Make sure that we've got the data you require. If we haven't, how are we going to do that?
And do you feel you're getting that support at the moment?
In some areas it's good. Our Home Office is not the best. I'm going to leave that statement there.
But they don't exist to be trade facilitative, so
well,
it's not surprising.
There's some of that, but actually, if they were just to communicate better than they did, it would help because we can help them, but that's the way it goes.
Yeah. Moving on to...
Can I just add one quick thing on SBS?
Yep.
Because
Yes.
I thought it might be of interest. There was, you mentioned sort of stability points. Obviously, a number of other parties have said that they would scrap the SBS deal. And interesting, some polling I've seen says that nearly 2/3 of voters back the SBS deal, even when explicitly it says that deal would include alignment with EU regulations. So, actually there's significant public support for, I think, the bulk of the changes that the
Fingers
were agreed as
crossed.
part of the reset. Of course, things can change, particularly on Brexit. But I do think that is I think, gives some strength, I think, of support for the ideas going forward. And I think does suggest there is actually scope on UK-EU relations, perhaps more than was previously thought. And you can kind of see that a bit with how the government's tackling these issues. Like, for instance, kind of leading on youth mobility over this conference. I wouldn't have expected that a year or 2 ago. So.
I think it's about trying to, and I think I don't think sort of the Prime Minister bit off more than he can chew, but I think draping of all this in a big EU reset has given other parties kind of scope to sort of get hot under the collar about this being kind of redoing, undoing Brexit, etc. And I think what the government really needs to do, and all governments need to do post-Brexit, is try and frame this as this is about regularizing cooperation, whether it's on energy, sort of shared challenges. This is not about sort of changing the relationship every single time. This is about genuinely tackling challenges because of our geographical and otherwise proximity as they arise. And the more you can make that normal, rather than just we're trying to, repair what the last government did, the less people will, I think, become incensed about this as kind of going back on what we did on Brexit. So I think the comms around it are quite important.
I don't know what you see, Lynn, but when I speak to guys in the EU and the departments I deal with, I see a sort of a cooperation, actually. I don't see them being difficult to deal with. Sometimes you get, well, you left, you've got to get on with it. But often I get, actually, can we do this together? How can we improve it? We talk about the French, we're moving the freight across the French border. How can we make that smart? How can we share data with you that you shared it with us?
So we hear three things. So one, we see quite a lot of scar tissue in DG trade.
Yep.
There is definitely some...
In the Commission?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely at administration level a deep well of resentment. That is just a fact, and that doesn't kind of make things go faster. At the political level, by contrast, actually we see politicians get the big picture. They see the imperative of us working more closely together in a more dangerous world. But then, frankly, there is a real market of, as you say, offering quite practical opportunities, which they don't see the UK as picking up, particularly on customs facilitation, digital trade, trusted trader schemes, exchange of data. And very often, they will say to us, well, look, we just don't know what the UK wants. Here are 4 or 5 areas where we could make practical progress, but you need to tell us what the UK wants.
How does it go?
Yeah.
If we can move on from the EU for a bit, I know all of you mentioned in your opening remarks various, or I think a couple of you did, anti-dumping measures. And Liam, I know you said as well that as Labour tries to attract investment to the UK, some of that money is likely to come from China.
Yeah.
How do you look at China in the trading landscape that we currently have? And how do you, balance the fact that China is an enormous economy with the fact that we have a very mercurial president in the US who is not necessarily of the same mindset?
Well, first, our trade with China over the last decade or so has been growing at a compound rate of about 13% a year. So even when relations have been in the deep freeze, actually trade has grown faster, if anything, at those moments. The second thing we have to do is to basically create some predictability to Chinese trade. And I've argued before that means we've got to be much clearer about our economic security regime, what's permissible, what's not permissible. Second, we need to get CBAM in place to make sure that there are proper safeguards around carbon. And then third, we need the equivalent of a Uyghur Forced Labour Act so that we have proper safeguards against forced labour. And every time I've met the USTR in Washington, they raise that with me. They put it again in the communique with President Trump and Keir Starmer. They are serious about this, and it is long overdue that we acted on this. But then the final sort of challenge to it all is, Steve says, the unpredictability of the US regime makes this just really difficult. So when we sat down with the CFIUS team in Washington a bit earlier on in the month, they were very clear that they were, in their words, building the aeroplane while the aeroplane was actually flying in the air. They have changed their tune a couple of times now on diffusion controls on NVIDIA chips, for example. So I think their current position is that you can use the latest chips to build large-scale learning data centers in the Gulf. Those are not safe from Chinese influence. And so the kinds of safeguards that President Biden had in place to stop our adversaries acquiring access to some of the latest capabilities that we're pioneering are arguably weaker when it comes to China than they were under the last administration. Now, these change, they kind of move around a bit, but for the UK, it is incredibly important that we retain and maintain our ITAR exemptions that allow us to work on, some of the most secret and important technology in and around AUKUS, for example. And, I think by and large, we've got a strategic interest in aligning our economic security regime with the United States and Europe. Both of them are in a stronger place than we are today. But what is important now is that we kind of write it down and make it clear, because we've got some big decisions to take. So if you think we've got about £1 trillion worth of inward investment, or of investment coming into infrastructure, lots of that is going to be in the energy system. And how are we going to be really confident that we're not going to be ripping out Mingyang equipment from offshore wind farms in the way that we had to rip out Huawei kit from the telecoms network? Are we really clear about that today? I just don't think we are.
Yeah, I mean, you could see also a case where I think we saw it, that because obviously the Chinese state sort of directs so much of the economy, that sort of investment decisions that Chinese automakers were making in Mexico, I think when they agreed to align some of their own economic security measures to the US, they were ordered to pause that, right? So that, there's a bit of kind of uncertainty as well, sort of wrapped into this. This is where the connection between trade and sort of investment happens. Is similarly in a different vein. How do you know if we decide to align? And there is some reference to it in the outline framework between the UK and the US sort of agreement that needs to be padded out. But how do you know if the UK takes more steps in that direction to align on some of these economic security measures and export controls, for example, that suddenly China's going to sort of say, direct its companies to basically stop the investment? It's quite the interconnection and uncertainty is quite considerable there.
Yeah, it's quite capricious.
And is that a risk that the UK could take, Liam?
So I don't know, but I mean, we have a big baseline report coming out on economic security in about 6 weeks' time, which is just going to make the point, as much as anything else, that economic security regime is just not fit for the new times that we're now in. And this is kind of one of the kind of consequential decisions that we're going to need to take. Where are we going to permit investment and where are we not? My hunch is that you could get to a place where you could allow some of this Chinese investment in sensitive infrastructure like offshore wind, as long as you were convinced that you had a diversified supply, so that if you got to the moment where you did need to take it out, there were alternative suppliers that you were able to switch back in, which is what we were able to do on telecoms, but where arguably we're not in a position to do that on other parts of critical national infrastructure today. So taking a decision about what are the sovereign capabilities that we need as a country, what do we have to do here, what do we have to make here, and what are we prepared to trade for, is really important. And it's something that we have been nagging the government to define their sovereign capabilities for about 6 months now. They say they are going to do it, they assure us they're going to do it, but they haven't done it yet.
Like a lot of things, yes. I suppose that brings us to the fact that the government has announced an industrial strategy, a trade strategy, a small businesses strategy.
So many strategies.
How much do all of those strategies link together, and how much are they actually helpful at the moment? Marley, perhaps?
Well, yeah, the government has been very busy producing lots of strategies.
Conceptually.
And I think, I think there's a lot of value, particularly in the industrial strategy and the trade strategy. And I think trade strategy is actually very thoughtfully written. I think it captures the context well. And, as I was saying earlier, I think it kind of sets out a number of different sensible ways forward. But ultimately, it's about how you actually implement it. So I think there's obviously a huge question now about going forward, implementing it. I mean, in a way, the strategy came at a slightly odd time, because obviously you'd had so much change. You'd had the Trump administration coming in with the tariff regime. You had these 3 trade deals or 3 economic deals being secured by the UK, and then this trade strategy. So it kind of, there was a lot going on. In a way, a huge amount had happened even before the trade strategy had been published. So I think, we argued for a trade strategy, we argued for industrial strategy for a long time, so I'm not going to criticize the government for then producing all these strategies. But, I guess the next step now is to kind of actually see it through, to make sure that these are delivered on the ground. And also, I think, not losing that strategic focus in a way. So I think having further updates to the strategy as the geopolitics changes and as we see new challenges would be really valuable as well.
Yeah.
You do see a little bit of not more than a little, actually, to be fair. You do see crisscrossing. So when you look at the trade strategy, some of the kind of announcements about how they're going to kind of reprioritize and retarget export support is aligned to some of the sort of key IS8 sort of sectors in the industrial strategy. So yeah, you do see some of that crisscrossing. I mean, the question then becomes, how about like, you know, the industrial strategy has these 8 sort of key areas / sort of sectors, and then it has frontier sectors, sort of, you know, sort of, for example, within the advanced manufacturing, things like space and batteries, and are those going to get the same kind of look in across to sort of the way in which we prioritize our sort of, I wouldn't just call it trade, but kind of international economic institutional arrangements with other countries?
I mean, I guess one of the, it's inherently a trade strategy, and as we kind of came across this when we did the report at IPPR, because of the nature of trade, you can't make it so sectoral as you do with industrial strategy. So it's because there's so many more horizontal issues. So naturally, it's not always going to align in the neatest way possible.
But making them more bite-sized and not just being about the FTAs does allow you to be a little bit more targeted with kind of agreements that will support certain sectors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And Mali, as you mentioned, it's all very well having a trade strategy, but when you have a very unpredictable regime in the US, which is our biggest single trading partner, it kind of all could go to pot, potentially. So, I mean, how do we look at the agreement that we have reached with the US when potentially, you know, the agreement that we reached back in May, I think it was, the initial agreement that we reached with Trump's regime hasn't actually come into force in the way, you know, for example, steel tariffs, that hasn't, the agreement that we reached has not been put into action.
There have been 2 headline commitments and others haven't been transposed.
Exactly. So how much can we rely on those agreements, I suppose, when they don't actually happen? Don't know who wants to take that.
Well, not very much. I mean, the capriciousness of trade policy means that it is all pretty unpredictable and pretty unreliable. I mean, there are areas that, I mean, we've recommended about 5 areas where you could actually pursue just some practical win-wins, and that is in areas like digital trade, mutual recognition of qualifications. I mean, there are sort of, you know, some practical places that could take out some of the friction. But, you know, the reality is when we talk to the UK American business community, what they basically say is, look, it's basically fine. Just try not to fuck this up.
Yeah.
You know, just try not to disrupt what are basically quite functional arrangements. And so that is just kind of worth bearing in the back of the mind.
Double-edged sword to ambition when it comes to the current administration. And actually, just lastly, I mean, just coming back briefly on China, you know, I think there's a bit of Schadenfreude and sort of schizophrenic approach to, you know, the administration and Republicans and Democrats, to be fair, in Washington definitely want to take a sort of fairly consistently hard line on kind of a trade with both directly from the US, but also trading partner with China. But sometimes the president is willing to be much more transactional about it. So there were, you know, the legislation, for example, around TikTok to keep authorizing in the United States kept being extended. And I would watch senators like definite hawks, like sort of Senator Cotton and sort of Hawley, basically sort of tearing their hairs out insofar as Republicans do that publicly about sort of the president, saying, we don't like this. But actually, in the end, the deal-making instinct of, I think, the president kind of won out. So sometimes it's, I think, to maybe sort of further take what Liam was saying, that the ability to have consistent policy towards China is a little bit muddled.
And just to say, I mean, Ali and probably others are following this closer than I am, but I guess the next challenge on the US will be these pharmaceutical tariffs. 100% tariffs.
And film tariffs now as well.
And film tariffs.
I didn't think he was going
I
to
don't know how you tariff a film, but...
And what is preferential treatment? Because actually the EU agreement is a little bit more specific on the UK getting some sort of preferential arrangement on pharma tariffs. The UK's one is a bit vaguer. I'm not sure I would have done, to be honest. I saw the Irish Taoiseach kind of talking about as soon as the Truth Social post came out that, you know, reminding publicly the US administration that the EU deal said that they'd basically be sort of protected and capped, at least for for non-generics to be capped to 15%. But, you know, sometimes all bets are off when it comes to the actual detail of it with the president. Yeah,
I know some of the panelists have to leave a little before 5, so I will try and...
I've got to leave in 3 minutes.
Come to everyone's summaries now. I will come to yours first then. But I mean, I guess I'll close with the question of, I was watching Chris Bryant at a panel yesterday, our new trade minister, and he said that although, you know, there's a recognition that we need to move beyond FTAs, to look at other ways to help improve our trading relationship with the rest of the world, he is very keen on doing more FTAs. So I suppose I would ask you the question, what country would you like us to see an FTA, close an FTA with most keenly? And what else would you like to see the government lead on in terms of trade strategy?
So my preference is that we get the deal done with Switzerland as fast as possible. And you know, that is good for the financial services industry, which is a really important growth driver. But also the dynamics of the UK-Swiss relationship could have quite a virtuous impact on the way that Brussels treats both of us. And some of the innovations in that relationship are really important and quite exciting. And so just being able to demonstrate to Brussels that there are different ways of European nations trading together, I think would be all to the good. I think it would be win-win-win. Quite what the GCC deal is going to deliver, you know, unclear. We'll have a report on that next year. Turkey,
that's the one
obviously,
that some people think is actually closest to happening.
I'm sure it
that
is.
Should be is another.
I think it could even be this year. I think.
Yeah.
Quite what it's going to deliver, I'm not quite sure. It's going to be, you know, quite thin. But I mean, beyond that, you know, we would then say, look at particular kind of sectoral approaches. So look at digital trade in particular. Look at things like IP protection. Look at, you know, our services, superpower exporters. You know, these are things that are actually going to have the biggest impact on GDP growth in the short term. And frankly, you know, that is what we need.
Do you need to
I'm going to bid adieu.
exit?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Going. Steve, do you want to provide your thoughts on that?
Look, totally, you know, totally with all of that. I can understand the benefits of what's going on around Switzerland, and that would be a different aspect of what's happening. That would make a lot of sense. For our members, it doesn't really matter once the deal's done. We just make it work. So whatever they agree, we end up delivering, and that's what works for us. Right?
Ali, do you have any different priorities that you would put ahead of that very long list that Liam mentioned?
It was interesting to hear about Switzerland. I mean, keep in mind that with Switzerland, we actually do have a sort of financial specific arrangement that was done that Treasury did last year. But for me, I'm just really interested in anything that gets done, like a mass focus on utilization and implementation, because very often a trade deal also contains a bunch of commitments for kind of regulators and departments to sort of cooperate with their counterparts. Not actually provides a framework for further cooperation. And I know that sort of, you know, people in the department are always keen to remind people that it's not a silver bullet. So for me, I'm much more focused on anything that gets, like India, let's speed up ratification. I know it has to go through various parts of the Indian political system, but I really want to get to that because I think some of the trade barriers in there are so prohibitively considerable that actually the opportunity for traders to actually make use of it is enormous.
Yeah, and Marley, I mean, that kind of issue around utilizing the trade agreements once they're there, it's something I've heard with the CPTPP, for example. You know, people saying, you know, we don't really know what it brings us. We don't actually know how to, you know, increase our relationship with, say, Malaysia. So yeah, I suppose that is a key point. Anything else that you would like to see from the government?
Yeah, so, you know, as I said earlier, I mean, I think that should be a real focus. It was part of the trade strategy. I think it's just a question of now delivering and seeing what the best mechanism is for delivering that. You know, is it you know, via experts who are in country? Is it about kind of trade, sort of specific sectoral specialists? Is it about kind of actually working locally with businesses? Maybe it's a combination of all. So I think there's some real work to be done there. And I think there's also some basic things about just like making sure the information is clearer on the government's website. That there's easier ways to kind of actually just navigate that information. That on CPTPP, I'm not even sure it's actually that obvious at all at the moment for businesses exactly.
Plus, you've got other bilateral arrangements that, you know, if you think that businesses don't know how to make use of existing like bilateral agreements, think about something that's sort of a block agreement, and you think, oh my gosh. But it was interesting to listen to. Because on some areas of tariffs bilaterally with countries that are in the CPTPP, for those of you who don't know, the sort of Asia-Pacific Rim countries that we have a deal with through CPTPP, some of our bilateral arrangements that we already have separate, so for example, Australia, New Zealand, that are within the CPTPP, some of the tariff preferences bilaterally are better, but listening to, I think it was a former South Korean trade minister who was talking about RCEP, which is another sort of pan-Asian sort of agreement that I think China's sort of part of, that a lot of businesses, similarly, there are agreements between the members of RCEP that are more generous in terms of their tariff preference, but actually because of things like rules of origin and scale and regional trade, there were businesses that were making better use of the bloc agreement than the actual bilateral provisions. And I think that the trade literacy of businesses in the UK, despite Brexit, is still fairly low. So trying to kind of explain, that's why the sort of the guidance process and why, you know, particularly when it's the sort of Steve's members who are the people that are not only doing the paperwork, can actually make traders, importers, and exporters aware of the opportunities to use them, efficiencies in their supply chain, because otherwise you're just relying on consultants. Brexit was like a boon for consultants, basically telling them how to make efficiencies in their supply chain and deal with compliance. And we need to turn, you know, there was so much opportunity that I feel wasn't leveraged properly. Businesses weren't used to dealing with trade policy. US businesses on average are much more trade literate when it comes to how we use trade agreements. Because the EU did it for us, I don't think we promoted it properly while we were in the EU. Brexit was an opportunity, but it was in a negative change scenario. So businesses had to get used to what does a trade barrier look like in practice? Oh my gosh, how do I deal with this going up? But they didn't really sort of, unless they had a consultant that it was outsourced to, they didn't take the opportunity to sort of actually understand their supply chains and say, what are the efficiencies I could be making? What are the agreements I could be making to sort of save my paperwork? And I think that's where certainly sort of the BIFA's members can help sort of turn the abstract policy into this is what you can do to actually cut the costs in your trading.
Yeah, and just to go back to CPTPP, just to kind of reiterate the point, like I recently met with the Japanese delegation. One of their questions was, you know, what are the benefits of CPTPP for UK business? And I was doing some research in advance, and there was barely anything out there that actually explains the specific benefits of CPTPP beyond the bilateral deals we have. Certainly nothing from the government that I could see. Maybe you've got it, Ali. All the
I extrapolated. It wasn't the official government line, but you know, it was such a big geopolitical sort of strategic bent that getting their heads around, you know, because there aren't many other examples of blocks where they stretch from Asia to the UK, and figuring out how you can use that to sort of reflect, because we aren't so integrated. Our supply chains are not so integrated between, apart from in automotive, which is a big maybe consideration, but we also have a Japan agreement that takes care of. So it's a learning curve, I think, for government to try and say what are the benefits, because they actually need to figure out how people can use it first and then extrapolate from there.
Okay. So yeah, in summary, I suppose we need more from the government in terms of implementing the trade agreements, and
it's the boring but really important stuff.
Yeah.
Otherwise, more of the same in terms of policy.
Well, I'd like to see what these smaller deals are going to look like. I think trying to figure out what they are and what industry wants them to prioritize, great in theory, but figuring out what they are is a little bit more difficult than just looking at a trade deal and saying, we're doing it with that country.
Yeah, I think as the trade strategy said, so, you know, sector deals, MRAs, as Liam was saying, sort of digital economy agreements, and as I was mentioning on sort of supply chain agreements, I think those are all kind of good opportunities moving ahead, not just FTAs. I'm less worried about FTA. I think all the kind of obvious FTAs have been kind of secured at this point, at least. The low-hanging fruit have been, so I would focus more on these other types of deals.
For sure. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us, and thank you very much to our panellists, to Ali, to Marley, and to Steve. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you.
I'm trying to think of another country, who it might be.
I know, I can't.